assure the speakers that we will pay tribute to their words in the same way that my father would have paid tributes. Pam and Ruth, on the car ride home, we will be discussing the CPD method. We will want to make sure that you understand very clearly the difference between the CPD method and the problem that it addresses, and give you Camus' approach to a rather different set of problems. As I was sitting here listening, I was reminded of what I believe is my first ICP-related memory. In about 1968, it probably was 1968, my father was attempting to finish a piece of work. A habit of my father's that no one managed to comment on was that he rarely believed that any time before a deadline should be unexplained. And actually tended to believe that as between, there's a classic problem in economics, which is when should you cut down a tree, and at what point will the tree grow so fast that it's better to leave the tree growing. My father basically had an enormous bias towards keeping the tree growing. He believed that anything could be improved, and it was too bad. When he was trying to finish a project, this was in the early days when you wrote things on paper, and he was up against it, and he needed to check that he had the numbers right. And so I was called in to perform the vitally important service of checking when he read a column of numbers on a different piece of paper. I was supposed to check that they were the same column of numbers. And about every 3 or 4 minutes, he would read one that was wrong. And I'd say, that's wrong. He'd say, it's okay, we can just keep going. And you go 3 or 4 minutes, same thing would happen. That's wrong, Dad. And then, he read one that was wrong, didn't seem any different to me. And I said, that's wrong. He said, really? And it proceeded to be 5 minutes of turning over other pieces of paper and the like to figure out what was happening. And I was his son, so I was a relatively curious sort. So I inquired, why did error 6 warrant an extensive investigation, whereas errors 1 through 5 had seemed to be non-issues? And he confessed with a bit of a smile that errors 1 through 5 had been intended to see whether I was awake. And he had introduced them in the reading, whereas error 6 was an actual error. He loved the ICP. He thought about the ICP a great deal. Many judge presidents of the World Bank and managing directors of the International Monetary Fund by how successful they are in enlarging the scope, scale, and significance of those institutions. Others judge presidents of the World Bank on the basis of whether a contribution was made to reducing global poverty, and judge managing directors of the IMF on the basis of whether financial stability was maintained. Not my father. He saw the function of the president of the World Bank and the managing director of the IMF as the support of purchasing power and its dissemination as widely as possible. And you got some points for publishing purchasing power parity data, but in order to get real and total points, you had to slay the exchange rate based nominal GNP dragon. And eventually, it has largely happened. But for every moment that it did not happen, he he worked very hard over many, many years on the data. Part of what interested him was what you could learn that would influence economic policy. The fact that if you were setting foreign aid allocations, it actually mattered how poor countries were, and that there really was an important difference between being 50 times 1/50th of the U.S. standard of living and being 1/15th of the U.S. standard of living, which was essentially the ICP's revision with respect to India and Sub-Saharan Africa, as some see. And part of what interested him was the scientific challenge of understanding relationships between exchange rates and prices in a better way. But ultimately, it was not the economic policy aspects that were of most interest to him. They were frankly of more interest to me. What was of greatest interest to him was a deep and profound conviction, and I think it is a conviction that informs this association, that better measurement makes better science, and better science makes a better world. You know, my Harvard colleague, Peter Gallison, has written extensively on aspects of scientific revolutions, to the point where there is at least some discussion that distinguishes between two views of scientific progress. The one that Pam and Ruth learned in high school, and the one that I think probably informs most of us, is some version of Thomas Kuhn's theory of scientific revolutions. You have theories, data come, data in some way upset the theories. When a lot of data comes that upsets the theory a lot, somebody has to invent a new theory, and then we have a new theory, and so science progresses. And that's some version of, when you go to 10th grade and you learn about the scientific method, they say there's hypothesis, and then there's experiment, and then there's new hypothesis. It's sort of like that. And that is a theory of scientific progress, and it is very important. There is a different theory of scientific progress, which is that if you have the right measurements, it's all actually fairly obvious what's going on, and you can learn what's true and change your mind. When the telescope got invented and people saw the moons of Jupiter going around Jupiter, they were no longer in doubt that it was false, that the Earth was the center of the universe. When the microscope was invented, then people knew that there were cells. It wasn't really because somebody had a new theory, it was because somebody had a new instrument. They could look and see through the microscope. And if you look, some substantial part of scientific progress takes that latter form. Social sciences are different from hard sciences, to the point where there are those who say that anything that has to call itself science isn't. Political science, social science, Christian science. But there is a truth there in social science as well. And that truth is that better measurements lead you to see things and understand things fairly easily that you could not have seen or understood without those measurements. People have asked the question, why is it that the Keynesian revolution came so dramatically? answer to that question is, of course, the profundity of the Depression. Part of the answer is the brilliance aspects of Keynes' book. But part of the answer was the development of national income accounting that led to a set of measurements for which that provided a framework that let people carry on research that would not have been possible without those measurements. You know, somebody once said to me about technology, that you know that a technology has really arrived when you notice its absence more than its presence in a hotel room. TV crossed that threshold sometime in the early 1960s. Wireless crossed that threshold about 4 years ago. And something similar is, I would suggest, true with respect to our economic concepts. There was a time when there wasn't such a thing as a GDP. Adam Smith, even Alfred Marshall, lived their whole life in places where there wasn't such a thing as the GDP. Nobody knew the term, nobody measured it, it wasn't a thing. Until some point, there wasn't such a thing as a measured unemployment rate. And people thought about the world differently. And now you sort of can't imagine the world, you can't imagine thinking about an economy without thinking about its GDP. Something like that is becoming true with respect to international accounts. And that is perhaps the most important part of the legacy that Irv and Al and my father are leaving behind, and the legacy that will be so ably carried on going forward in PWT 8. That because we measure differently and we measure more, we think better and more clearly about the world. Just one final observation, and it wasn't one that I was going to make, but I can't, I was struck by it. Bettina, can you just run through the slides quickly? And I'll tell you to stop at a certain point. Keep going, stop. I just happened to notice this. If my father had been here, he would have stopped and paused, and with certainty, he would have remarked on the fact that I am actually puzzling over as I sit here, which is, professors are supposed to do more research over the summer because they don't have to teach. And indeed, the NSF pays their salary over the summer, and the NSF doesn't pay their salary during the year. And so why is it that in June, July, and August, those are the months that the ICP receives the smallest number of hits? And if he were alive, that would have been a lengthy topic of discussion. There would have been a theory that, well, perhaps people download their data in the spring and then they work on it during the summer. There would have been a theory that maybe people in their vacation homes don't have access to the internet, and so they have stored it in a different place, and that would have been tested by looking at past data to see whether that pattern was always there. Those numbers are more carefully constructed. Those numbers are better